In 2019, a Reddit user named Rakura Kukabishi posted an image to a nature subreddit. The post was labeled Black Diamond, Washington State, USA, and it's exactly what you'd expect from that label. Emerald green water, dense forest, the kind of place that looks clean and quiet and almost unreal. But the reason people remember that post isn't the picture, it's a comment underneath it, dropped so casually, but for us, it's the starting point of our mystery. In the replies, a user named Valeridian Jedi says, "Hey, if this is where I think it is, I'm pretty sure I was almost murdered a few miles from here." And immediately the tone changes. The original poster replies, "Where? So I can avoid it." Valerian Jedi replies with just enough detail to be frustrating and just enough detail to feel real. "It was around Mount Rainier National Park if this is where I'm thinking it is. Wouldn't really recommend avoiding it though. It was gorgeous and I doubt the murderer is still out there. It's been a few years." The OP responds politely like they're trying to keep the conversation normal, even though it isn't. "I don't think those two places are that close, but I've been to Mount Rainier Park and that place is definitely stunning. Come visit again if you have time. It's so much more beautiful in spring." Smile face. And then another user, management is their username, says what everybody else was thinking when they were reading this. "Wait, what? Elaborate. This sounds way too interesting of a story not to tell. Was it a famous murder or just some random meth head trying to kill you?" And that is when Valerian Jedi finally stops teasing it and actually lays everything out. And I am just gonna read this entire paragraph from the Reddit post because the way that he writes it already is very unsettling on its own. And I think it comes from how natural it is. He's not trying to impress anybody. He's just describing something that still messes with him to this day. He says, quote, "Honestly, no idea. I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington near Mount Rainier. Like not an official campground, just way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night, I wake up and hear something. Open my tent, and there is a guy sitting by where my fire had right been outside my tent. He saw me open the tent and took off." Pause. Even just that first part is nasty because it's not an "I heard something in the distance" story. It's a "there is a person sitting right next to where I was just sitting earlier" story. A person close enough that the moment Val opens the tent, the guy reacts, realizes he's been seen, and runs. A person close enough that the moment this Jedi guy opens the tent, the guy reacts, realizes he's been seen, and runs. I guess I'll just call him Jedi from here on out. I didn't really think about that, but I don't want to read Valerian every time because I keep stumbling over that word. Then Jedi describes what he does next, and this is where the whole thing gets its shape. He doesn't leave the park instantly. He stays out there, but he tries to make it impossible for anyone to find him again by accident. He says, quote, "Then 2 days after that, and 10 to 15 miles in totally random directions that nobody could take the same path as on accident, I was sitting by the fire and started hearing noises that I got more and more convinced were a person." Pause. And right there is the first thing that makes this hard to shrug off. Because if you're camping near a trail or a known site, sure, you might bump into somebody else. But he's describing a choice to go deep into places where you're not supposed to run into anyone at all. And then he's describing the feeling that somebody is still there anyway. He calls into the darkness and the darkness answers him. Quote, "I called out to them and out of the darkness someone was like, 'Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?' I said no and they kept talking from just out of my line of vision." And I have to pause again here just to point out that this is an important detail because it's not just someone asked me a question, it's someone positioned themselves exactly right where I can't see them on purpose and kept talking. Okay, but anyway, quote, "I tried to see them with my flashlight, but they yelled, 'Aim that way.' And I kind of spooked and I did not want to piss off a potentially crazy person, so I did. After like 15 minutes of them talking, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer, so I shined my light again and it was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. He had to have followed me 15 miles over 2 days because there is no way he could have accidentally wound up in the same spot as vast as that wilderness was. As soon as my light hit him, he took off again though. I started to chase him but didn't want to get lost in the wilderness and the dark, so I stopped quickly. I hiked back out over 3 days, constantly doubling back, trying to throw anyone following off my trail and occasionally hiding and waiting. On the first night of that, twice I heard what sounded like a person walking circles outside my tent. And on the second night, I heard what I thought was an animal making noises at first in the distance, but slowly decided that they sounded more like a human making animal calls. But it could have actually been an animal. But I didn't actually see the guy again. I literally almost cried when I finally got back to my car. To this day, probably the most terrifying experience I've ever had. Oh my god, that is horrifying, and the first person account makes it even scarier. Again, like I said, how natural it is. And then other people in the thread react exactly how you'd expect. One user, GlassHeart2002, says, "That sounds terrifying. We camp around Rainier often. Well, we used to. It's beautiful and has some of our favorite trails, but it seems there's more crazy people out in the woods these days. Or maybe I just never paid close attention before." I have a post from a few months ago about a guy that terrorized us years ago while camping. We never returned anywhere near that spot again. Glad you made it out okay and they didn't escalate. And before you guys ask, I did go looking around quite a bit to find this user's own experience from the Mount Rainier area, and I couldn't find it. I looked for a while, and I wish I could because it sounds interesting, but I couldn't. Anyway, the management user comes back and chimes in by saying, quote, "Holy shit, I got chills reading this. Scary shit. That's terrifying to say the least," unquote. And then to this, Jedi replied by saying, quote, "Yeah, I really can't even articulate what that kind of fear felt like. Genuinely felt like I was being hunted through the forest and could be murdered at any minute. And there wasn't cell reception or anything, so I was completely on my own. It was absolutely unreal to be having to plan how to best not be murdered. Like, was brainstorming on whether I should use my tent as a decoy and sleep outside it and stuff. Not to mention not really knowing the guy's intention, so not knowing if I did see him again, if I should just do my best to stab him as soon as I saw him before he could kill me, or if he was just crazy but not malicious. It was pretty horrifying all around," end quote. I do want to point out that management came back again with a great joke where he said, "Well, you could have force choked him the next time you saw him," which is a great joke because of, Jedi's name. But anyway, that is the entire foundation. A normal looking man in an abnormal place behaving in a way that doesn't line up with hiking, camping, or even basic human interaction. He doesn't introduce himself, he doesn't ask for help, he doesn't wander in confused. He sits close, waits to be discovered, runs when he's seen, and then reappears days later, close again, asking a question that doesn't seem to match the location, and insisting on staying just outside the light. But Jedi's story does not end here at the end of this Reddit thread, because upon some more research, it seems that Jedi took that idea of posting it to No Sleep or Creepypasta to heart. But those subreddits are for, fictional stories, made up stories, which are great, but that's not what happened to me. So he chose to put it into r/let's-not-meet, whose Reddit description reads, "A place to read spine-tingling, unusual, terrifying," keyword here, "true stories about people you never want to meet again." The subreddit is basically No Sleep for true stories, and this is amazing because Jedi posted this story again in much more vivid detail here. So, in the original thread, the first encounter is shocking but easy to minimize. A man sitting by a dead fire outside a tent in the middle of the night is terrifying, but it still leaves room for rationalization. In the longer account, Jedi emphasizes how unremarkable the man looked. He wasn't feral, he wasn't visibly unwell, and he wasn't dressed like someone surviving off-grid. He was just a normal guy, wearing everyday clothes, sitting silently a few feet from the tent without a backpack, without gear, without any obvious reason to be there. And when Jedi opened the tent, the man didn't react react aggressively or defensively. His eyes widened in what Jedi describes as pure shock, and then he ran. That detail matters because it flips the expected roles. Whoever this was, he wasn't expecting to be seen. The second encounter is where the story stops being dismissible. In the shorter original version, it's easy to gloss over the distance. But in this longer account, Jedi makes it explicit. After the first incident, he deliberately changed his route over the next few days, hiking 10 to 15 miles in erratic, unintentional directions, paths no one could plausibly replicate by chance in terrain that vast. When he hears someone outside his firelight again and calls out, the voice doesn't announce itself. It doesn't apologize, it asks a question: do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon? Jedi says no, says he doesn't even think that's a real place, and the voice continues talking from just outside his line of sight. And what's new here is the interaction. The man doesn't step into the light, he doesn't approach, he talks for roughly 15 minutes, which honestly is a lot of time given the situation, asking unrelated, almost meaningless questions, grunting acknowledgements, keeping the conversation going without ever resolving it. When Jedi tries to shine his flashlight toward the man snaps back, ordering him to aim away. Jedi complies, not because it makes sense, but because antagonizing someone unseen in the wilderness feels dangerous in a way that's hard to articulate unless you've been there. And then comes the moment that collapses every remaining rational explanation. Jedi realizes the voice sounds closer. He raises the flashlight again, and because he's closer now, he can see. It's the same man from 2 nights earlier. Not someone similar, not someone who could plausibly have crossed paths with him on a trail. The same man, close enough to be illuminated, close enough to confirm recognition. At that point, coincidence stops being an option. As Jedi puts it, there is no possible way this person ended up being there unless he had been following him. The aftermath is where the fear becomes sustained rather than explosive. Jedi doesn't immediately flee in panic. He ends the trip methodically, hiking out over 3 days, doubling back, altering his path, hiding and waiting to see if anyone passes by. This isn't a man running from a monster, it's someone actively planning how not to be murdered, alone, without cell service, aware that no one knows exactly where he is. He describes thinking through decoys, escape strategies, even whether he should attack first if the man reappears. Thoughts that only surface when you feel hunted, not just startled. The nights during the hike out add one final layer. On the final night, he hears what sounds like footsteps circling his tent twice, yet sees no one when he looks. On the second night, the sounds change. At first, they resemble animal noises, distant and ambiguous, but slowly take on something human. Howling, mimicry, something that could be an animal but doesn't feel like one. He never sees the man again. But that absence doesn't bring relief. It extends the tension because of the question of whether he's still being watched never gets resolved. And then when Jedi finally reaches his car, again, he describes nearly crying from relief. Years later, he still can't explain who the man was or what he wanted. And the longer version here doesn't provide answers, but it does make one thing unmistakably clear. Whatever this was, it wasn't random and it wasn't brief. On another very different part of Reddit, a eerily similar story began circulating. And it wasn't written by the same person, it wasn't posted in the same community for the same audience, and it didn't even describe the same circumstances. The only thing tying it to Jedi's story was a single, oddly specific question. The post was titled, "Bell's Canyon? Was hiking in Mount Rainier." Or Rainier? I don't know, guys. I'm not good at pronunciation, but anyway. It's spelled Rainier, so I'm gonna pronounce it like that. Sorry. It was shared 3 years ago as of recording, which would put this at about 2022. Although I have seen some sources say it was posted in 2013, which I don't know where that would be coming from, and I tried to do some investigation, but the account that it was posted from, Logical Prime Ape, is banned, so I cannot go back and look, but I don't know why people said it came out in 2013. It says 3 years ago, so 2022. Anyway, it was shared by a user who stated outright that they weren't particularly active on Reddit and didn't know where else to put it. According to their account, the incident took place during a Sunday afternoon on a hike on Mount Rainier. This wasn't deep backcountry camping, and it wasn't an off-trail expedition. The author describes reaching reaching Myrtle Falls, stopping to take in the view, then turning back around 5:30 p.m. to avoid walking too far in the dark. The trail was empty, no other hikers were visible. As the author walked along the Paradise River section of the trail, they heard a voice from off to their right. What stands out immediately is how the voice is described. Not confused, not curious, but angry, hostile, very deep, sounding like a large man, as the author puts it. The author couldn't see anyone at all, but could sense the direction the sound came from. The voice yelled out, "Hey, hey, hey." Startled, the author stopped and didn't respond. The voice came again, louder this time, closer, and more aggressive. At that point, the author froze. They mentioned carrying pepper spray and a small knife, which they quietly grabbed, not knowing whether being seen doing so would escalate the situation. Then, abruptly, the voice stopped. After what felt like a long stretch of silence, likely around a minute, the author continued walking, picking up their pace, but deliberately not running. They were still roughly an hour from their car and didn't want to provoke a chase. About 15 minutes later, the voice returned. According to the post, it sounded like it was coming from the same distance as before, which led the author to conclude that whoever was yelling had been following them. This time, the voice called out directly, "Hey you, where is Bell's Canyon?" The author stopped, turned toward the sound, and replied that they couldn't see anyone, and they didn't understand the question. There was no response here. Panicked, the author began a light jog, carefully pacing themselves so they could sprint if necessary, without exhausting themselves too quickly. After roughly 20 minutes, they slowed again, repeatedly looking over their shoulder. 5 minutes later, the voice came back once more. The same words, the same question. "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" This time, the author answered more firmly. They said they didn't know, had never heard of it, and claimed they were late to meet friends on the trail. The response was immediate and more intense. The unseen person screamed the question again, louder than before. At that point, the author ran, fully sprinted until they reached their car. By the time they got there, they described themselves as nearly vomiting from panic. The post ends with conclusion rather than resolution. The author says they will never hike that trail again, and openly speculates that the person was likely mentally ill. They also ask a final question that, in hindsight, would become the most unsettling part of the entire account. Where the hell is Bell's Canyon? According to them, it didn't appear anywhere online or on Google Maps for Washington State. At face value, this is just another unsettling hiking story. But placed alongside Jedi's experience, it introduces a coincidence that's difficult to ignore, not because it proves anything, but because it repeats something that doesn't need to repeat. A stranger in two different encounters, years apart, asking the same obscure question in the same general region. That's kind of weird, and whether that's coincidence, imitation, or just something else isn't clear yet. Almost immediately after this Myrtle Falls story was posted, people began poking at the details. Not the emotion and not the fear, but the logistics, and that distinction matters. The skepticism wasn't framed as "this didn't feel real," but rather, "this actually just doesn't line up with how this area works at that time of year." One of the earliest pushbacks came from users familiar with Mount Rainier's trail conditions, particularly in late April. A commenter from Seattle stated bluntly that the story couldn't be accurate because that section of trail still requires snowshoes at that time of year. And that's not a vague opinion, it's a claim rooted in seasonal access patterns that locals and frequent hikers recognize immediately. In late April, much of Mount Rainier, including higher elevation trails near Myrtle Falls, is typically still under significant snowpack, with restricted access and limited foot travel unless you're specifically equipped for winter conditions. That observation alone doesn't disprove the story, but it does raise an important question. What exactly was accessible and when? The author doesn't specify the year beyond saying it happened last week, doesn't clarify trail conditions, and doesn't mention snow at all, something that would be hard to ignore if it were present. For a story hinging so heavily on timing and movement that omission matters. There's also the issue of distance and pace. The author describes being roughly an hour from their car, then alternating between walking, light jogging, and sprinting before reaching the trailhead. Some commenters questioned whether it was realistic to jog downhill from Myrtle Falls to Cougar Rock in the way described, especially given the elevation changes, trail conditions, and time of day. Others pointed out that even if parts of the Paradise Valley Road are open sometimes on weekends during the winter season, that doesn't automatically make nearby trails snow-free or easily navigable. None of this conclusively proves the story didn't happen. What it does do is introduce friction, points where the narrative becomes harder to reconcile with known conditions. And that friction stands in contrast to Jedi's account, which, if you remember, while geographically vague, never contradicts known access patterns or seasonal realities. Jedi didn't anchor his story to a named trail, a specific time of year, or a pace that can be checked against maps and elevation charts. That vagueness weakens verification, but it also avoids contradiction. And what matters for this video, though, isn't deciding which explanation is correct, it's just acknowledging that not all sources carry the same weight. Jedi's account gained credibility through internal consistency and the sheer logistical improbability of coincidence, even if its exact location can't be verified. This Myrtle Falls story, by contrast, provides specific locations and times that involve scrutiny, and when scrutinized, those specifics don't hold up the cleanest. But to be fair, a lot of times when you're retelling a story, sometimes you just forget things or things don't line up. Like, I mean, the best example is like the biggest religion in the world, Christianity, is formed off of a book that was written about an account of a man's life like 50 to 100 years after that man lived. And those accounts aren't anywhere near like totally completely accurate, and even Christians will admit that, but there's a whole religion based around it. So these contradictions and issues don't make this story useless. It makes it weaker, and that distinction is important, because if this phrase, "do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon," is going to be treated seriously, then every instance of it needs to be evaluated honestly, not lumped together for the sake of mystery. At this point, the only responsible thing to do is slow down and check the ground beneath the story. Not interpret it and not mythologize it. Just verify the most basic claim at the center of everything. Does a place called Bell's Canyon actually exist where these encounters supposedly happened? The answer, at least when you look at Mount Rainier National Park itself, appears to be no. There is no officially recognized Bell's Canyon inside the park. It does not appear on National Park Service maps, trail maps, USGS topographic maps for the area, or any commonly used hiking databases associated with Rainier. There's no marked canyon, trail, basin, or colloquial landmark by that name within the park's boundaries. That matters because both stories place the question squarely inside or immediately adjacent to Mount Rainier, not somewhere vague in Washington state as a whole. But that doesn't mean the name itself is fictional. Washington does have places with similar names. There are canyons and geographic features elsewhere in the state that include Bell or Bells in the name, including areas outside Rainier, some far away, some closer, but none that would make sense as a casual walking destination from where either encounter took place. Importantly, none of those locations are within what could reasonably be described as walking distance from the areas mentioned in the stories, especially not without crossing major terrain barriers or leaving the park entirely. So if someone genuinely needed directions, the question doesn't line up with reality. A lost hiker asking for help usually references something visible, marked, or at least plausibly nearby. What trail is this? Which way to the parking lot? Is this the way to paradise? Bell's Canyon doesn't function like that. It isn't a known destination in that context, and it isn't something a random hiker would reasonably assume another person on the trail could point them toward. That's the core problem. The phrase isn't mysterious because it sounds spooky, it's mysterious because it doesn't fit. It's not tied to the map, and it's not anchored to the terrain, and importantly, it doesn't behave like a real navigation question. Even if someone were confused or mentally unwell, you'd still expect the name to correspond to something in the immediate environment. Here, it doesn't. And that's where this stops being a campfire story and starts becoming an investigative one. Because once you establish that Bell's Canyon isn't where it's being asked about, the question question changes. It's no longer where is Bell's Canyon, it becomes why is that specific name being used here at all? And the question doesn't have an answer yet, but it does give us a clear boundary. Whatever happened to Jedi and whatever happened to the OP in the second story doesn't revolve around a real destination inside Mount Rainier. The name itself is the anomaly. And also, who the fuck is this guy? So once you establish that Bell's Canyon isn't a real destination in the area where these encounters took place, the range of explanations narrows. Not toward something paranormal, necessarily, but toward a smaller set of human behaviors that actually fit the facts without inventing new ones. None of these explanations solve the mystery outright, but they simply describe what could account for the behavior without breaking reality. So, the most straightforward possibility is confusion or delusion. Someone could genuinely believe Bell's Canyon exists nearby, either because of faulty memory, mental illness, intoxication, or simple disorientation. That explanation works reasonably well in the abstract, especially for a lone person in the wilderness, but it starts to strain when you look at the behavior itself. A confused or lost hiker usually wants to be seen, not avoided. They step into the light, they would identify themselves, they would ask follow-up questions that move toward resolution. In both accounts, the person asking about Bell's Canyon does the opposite, staying hidden, controlling the interaction, and disengaging the moment visibility is forced. Then another possibility is a prank. Someone deliberately hiding off trail and shouting at hikers is not unheard of, especially in areas close to established routes. That explanation fits the second story more cleanly than the first. A prankster might enjoy provoking fear, might repeat a strange phrase, and might flee once confronted. What makes it less convincing for Jedi's experience is scale. Following someone off trail for days across miles of unmarked terrain without being detected until deliberately revealed would require a lot of commitment and risk that goes far beyond a casual scare. It's not impossible, of course, but it's definitely a different kind of prank. Then there's the idea of a copycat. Jedi's original comment predates the Myrtle Falls post, and the phrase itself is memorable. It's possible someone saw or heard about the first story and repeated the question intentionally. That explanation becomes more plausible given the second post's credibility issues and timing. It would also explain why the phrase appears again without the surrounding behavior matching exactly. However, this explanation still doesn't account for Jedi's experience on its own. It only works if the second story is derivative, not if both are independent. One of the more commonly suggested explanations in discussions around this case is that the phrase might function as a kind of code, something designed to test whether the person being addressed belongs in the area. So for example, there are rumors and possibilities of illegal grow operations and other sort of activity inside national parks, where lookouts might challenge unfamiliar people without directly confronting them. On paper, this sounds plausible. In practice, the behavior doesn't line up well. Someone protecting an operation wants efficiency. They want to identify outsiders quickly and either scare them off or alert others. Quietly following someone for days, engaging in prolonged, pointless conversation, and then fleeing when identified doesn't serve that goal. It creates risk rather than reducing it. And also, this wouldn't make sense location-wise for the second story, which took place on a common normal trail, not the middle of nowhere. If you strip everything else away, the phrase, the location confusion, the internet speculation, you're left with behavior. And the behavior described in Jedi's account is specific enough that it points toward a narrow band of human possibilities, even if it never resolves into a single explanation. Following someone 10 to 15 miles over the course of multiple days, especially off-trail, is not accidental. That kind of movement requires attention, endurance, and intent. It means matching pace without being seen, reading terrain well enough to avoid leaving obvious signs, and maintaining enough distance to observe without triggering confrontation. That alone rules out the idea of a casual hiker or someone simply lost. Whatever this person was doing, it required sustained focus. The way the encounters unfold reinforces that. The man stays just outside the firelight. He speaks without revealing himself. He reacts immediately and decisively the moment he's in the light. That pattern suggests avoidance rather than confusion. Someone who wants help steps forward. Someone who wants to socialize introduces themselves. Someone who doesn't want to be identified behaves exactly like this: controlling visibility, controlling distance, and disengaging the moment that control is lost. There are several human behaviors this could resemble, none of them comforting. It could be intimidation, someone deliberately trying to unsettle another person, engage their reaction. It could be fixation, an unstable attachment to a stranger that becomes dangerous simply through persistence. It could be opportunistic predation, someone waiting to see whether fear, exhaustion, or isolation creates an opening. Or it could be someone living out there, intentionally avoiding contact, but reacting unpredictably when discovered. And the point isn't to diagnose which one applies. The point is that all of them are human, and all of them are worse than a misunderstanding. And I found what's especially unsettling here is the restraint. The man never lunges, never threatens directly, never escalates beyond proximity and presence. That doesn't make the situation safer, it makes it harder to read. Fear usually spikes around clear danger. What Jedi describes is sustained ambiguity, where every decision carries risk because intent is never revealed. That kind of encounter sticks with people precisely because it never resolves into a clear moment of action. There's no resolution. In that sense, the scariest part of the story isn't what happened, it's what didn't. No explanation, no confrontation, no closure. Just the knowledge that someone chose to stay close, unseen, for reasons that never became clear. One of the most frustrating aspects of Jedi's account is also one of the most understandable: the lack of precise details. He never gives an exact trail, never pins down coordinates, never provides dates beyond a rough timeline. That makes verification difficult, and that matters if you're trying to assess risk rather than just tell a story. There are reasonable explanations for that vagueness. Jedi may have been camping illegally or without a permit and didn't want to admit it publicly. He may have avoided specifics to keep others from retracing his route or turning the location into a spectacle. Or he may simply not remember exact details years later, especially after an experience shaped more by fear than by record keeping. None of those explanations undermine the core account, but they do limit what can be independently confirmed. That limitation is important because it draws a boundary around what the story can and can't be used for. You can't turn it into a map-based reconstruction. You can't check ranger logs or weather data. You can't test the distances with certainty. And because of that, the story will probably never be solved in the way people expect internet mysteries to be solved. But that doesn't mean it's useless. You don't need exact coordinates to interpret behavior. You don't need a trail name to recognize risk patterns. Someone being followed off trail multiple times by a person who avoids identification and disengages when seen is a real-world danger regardless of where it happened. So the responsible conclusion here isn't certainty, it's scope. This may never be resolved to a single explanation, and that's okay. What matters is recognizing what the story actually demonstrates, that remote wilderness doesn't just hide animals or myths. Sometimes it hides people whose behavior doesn't fit social rules, whose intentions aren't legible, and whose presence is only noticed when it's already too close. And that's an uncomfortable truth, because it means the danger isn't exotic, it's familiar, it's human. By this point, it's clear that this story doesn't resolve cleanly, and it probably never will. But that doesn't mean everything about it is equally uncertain. Some parts are stronger than others, and being honest about that is the only way to end this responsibly. Jedi's account remains the core of the entire case. It's internally consistent, emotionally restrained, and behaviorally specific. The biggest weakness is also obvious: geography. Without exact locations, dates, and routes, there's no way to independently verify distances, terrain, or timing. That limits confirmation, but it doesn't automatically undermine the experience itself. What gives Jedi's story weight is not where it happened, but how the person behaved. And that behavior is coherent across the entire account. The Myrtle Falls story, by contrast, is weaker. It introduces the same phrase, but anchors itself to specific places and times that don't fully align with known conditions. Seasonal access, trail logistics, and pacing all raise questions. That doesn't mean it was fabricated, but it does mean it can't be treated as equally reliable. At best, it's a partial echo, something that overlaps in language, but not in strength. The third, taken together, the most reasonable conclusion is also the least dramatic. This is overwhelmingly likely to be a human scenario. Not a creature, not a phenomenon, not a legend, a person or people whose motives remain unknown. The unanswered question isn't what this was, it's why. And that question may never be answered. This story lingers because it doesn't give you rules. There's no monsters to identify, no behavior pattern to exploit, no clear moment where danger announces itself. Instead, there's a person who looks normal, speaks calmly, avoids being seen, and says something just weird enough to stick with you. That's harder to process than folklore. A bear behaves like a bear, a storm behaves like a storm, but a human without clear intent, especially in a place where help is far away, is unpredictable in a way that bypasses instinct. You can't reason with it, and you can't easily run from it without making things worse. The quiet reality underneath all of this isn't sensational, it's logistical. Being alone off trail means no one knows where you are. No cell service could mean no outside interruption. Distance means time. Time for fear to grow, for mistakes to compound, and for decisions to carry more weight than they would anywhere else. That's why this story didn't fade. Not because it suggests something impossible, but because it suggests something very possible, very human, and very hard to prepare for. Thank you guys for watching this video all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed this story and this breakdown. I had a good time with this. It's true crime kind of thing, so let me know in the comments if you want to see more of this, what you want to see, any cases you want me to cover, any mysteries, whatever. Let me know, guys. If you're on Spotify or YouTube, leave a comment. Thank you so much for listening again. I love you all. Have a great night and sweet dreams.